Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak at your symposium today to talk about integrated pest management in cultural heritage institutions. I'm just fighting off a bad cold, so please excuse me if my voice sounds a little bit rough. I'm also using Zoom's internal live transcription function, so any subtitles may not be 100% accurate. I'm Shelby Strommer, the Collections Care Coordinator at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign Library. I'm located in Urbana, Illinois, which is in the Midwestern United States, and the nearest major city is Chicago. Our library is the third largest, based on collection size, in the United States after the Library of Congress and the Library at Harvard University. As the Collections Care Coordinator, I oversee the preventative preservation of our paper-based materials, which includes integrated pest management, environmental monitoring, disaster planning, and other things. So today I'm going to talk to you about integrated pest management, also known as IPM. We'll start with what is IPM, why is it important, and then we'll go through the 4 phases of IPM, which are prevention, monitoring, identification, treatment, and resource. And then I'll share some resources to help you get started if you'd like to learn more. Integrated pest management is an ongoing cycle aimed at reducing pest damage to collections and ideally avoiding the application of toxic chemicals, which can be dangerous to both our collection materials and to human health. The most important aspect of IPM is prevention, and the other steps are monitoring, identification, and treatment. Why is IPM important? Here you can see some examples of collection materials that were damaged by pests. The first 2 images show holes and tunneling where insects have chewed through the paper of these books. And the third shows a leather-bound book cover in which something, maybe a silverfish or a cockroach, chewed a large portion of the leather off the covering of the book. This is another example of some pretty extreme tunneling in the cover of a book. There are places where the pest chewed all the way through the boards to expose the pages below. And here, something has chewed the edges of these pages. And you could also see some black and brown debris around the chewing marks. That's called frass. That's essentially pest droppings. And it can also include debris from chewing, carcasses, and casts from larvae. And this shows the damage caused by rodents. You can see some black debris, which is mouse droppings, and the liquid damage is urine. And not only is this disgusting and damaging to the collection materials, but rodents and other animal droppings can carry diseases that are a danger to humans. Since I work in a research library, my examples are book and paper, but pests can damage other collection materials as well. Certain kinds of beetles like to bore into wooden objects. Some pests like to eat textiles made of cotton, silk, and wool. They can cause a lot of damage to other kinds of objects made of organic materials like natural history or ethnographic collections as well. So what can we do to prevent pests in our collections? First, we try to minimize the likelihood of pests by preventing their access to food and water sources, which can be done by enacting and enforcing policies and procedures. Food and drink policies go a long way toward minimizing food sources for pests. You may want to consider whether your institution allows food, restricting food and drink to certain areas. Maybe you don't allow food and you only allow beverages in spill-proof containers. And you have to think about policies for both patrons and staff. I have worked at 2 different institutions in which coworkers found mice in their desk because they stored food in their drawers. If you're going to store food at work, I recommend glass containers because mice and pests can't chew through those. But pests are also attracted to other water sources. So for example, if you find drips or leaks, you want to report those and ensure that they are remedied as quickly as possible. Housekeeping is also essential, and your housekeeping and custodial or janitorial staff are a major partner in this. Your institution will want to make sure spills are wiped up promptly, trash with food waste is taken out daily. For example, in my current institution, most of our desk trash cans are not taken out every day. So we have designated food trash throughout the library that is emptied daily to prevent attracting pests. Next, your building envelope is also a major factor. Your building envelope is essentially what separates the outside from the inside of your space. Are there places pests can get in? Are there secure seals around the doors and windows? Is there a hole in your roof where bats and squirrels can get in? It's important to seal cracks, add sweeps to the bottom of doors, and place screens in windows so pests are less likely to enter your building. It's also important to reduce clutter and cardboard boxes, which provide harborage for pests, which provides them with somewhere to nest and hide. Next, I know some people like houseplants in their office, but I'm not a huge fan of decorative plants in cultural heritage institutions because they're often a great way to bring in pests. They can also attract pests because they're a source of food and moisture. And finally, new acquisitions, and especially gifts, can also be a source of pests. It may be helpful to have a policy about whether you will accept gift materials with signs of pest infestation or mold. Our rare and book manuscript library accepted 2 pallets of materials that had a pretty severe and active silverfish infestation, and then in the end they had to spend a long time decontaminating the collections and also the space where the items were stored. So maybe you want to have a policy about inspecting materials before you agree to accept incoming collections, or maybe you inspect everything before it is introduced to your storage space. Even better if you have a dirty room or space where you can quarantine incoming materials that might show signs of infestations. So in addition to prevention, the next step is monitoring. In my institution, we use sticky traps, also called blunder traps. They're a cost-effective option, and they do not have any bait or pheromones to lure pests. They just attract any that happen, they just catch any that happen to wander through. If you know you have an infestation, you may want to look into targeted pheromone traps, which are commercially available for a number of types of moths and beetles. There are also hanging traps to catch flying bugs and other options for vertebrate pests. When using sticky traps like these, you want to place them throughout the space, especially anywhere you think pests might be able to come in, such as near doors, windows, and drains. You want to place them parallel to the wall, like in these photos. So if the pests are traveling along the baseboards, they'll walk right into the traps. Here you can see one of our traps right next to a door in one of our collection spaces. And the other photo, it's a little bit harder to see, but the trap is right next to our loading dock garage door. If you do suspect that you have an infestation, you can always add more traps to try and pinpoint their source of entry or a specific infested collections object. This is a map of one of our libraries, and each of the blue dots represents one of our pest traps. As you can see, they're near windows, doors, and tucked in corners, places where pests are likely to travel. It's also important to document the location of your pest traps, whether that's with a map like this or some kind of list or spreadsheet, so that you're able to locate them later. So how and why do we identify pests? There are a ton of bug guides and resources with images and descriptions available online, and I've included several of those in the resource list that I'll share in just a few moments. It's also important to have a sense of what type of pests you're seeing to help inform how you want to proceed. Pests can indicate that there are gaps in your building or a housekeeping issue, as they may be drawn by a source of food or water. A lot of pests like warm and damp environments, so they can also indicate an issue with the collections environment. Some pests, like silverfish, cockroaches, and certain kinds of beetles, are a danger to collections because they'll eat paper, adhesives, cardboard, leather, and other organic materials, as we saw in some of the images earlier. Termites and certain beetles eat and bore through wood. Clothes moths like textiles. Depending on the size of the infestation, you may occasionally need to take steps to eradicate these pests from our collection materials to protect them. And I'll get to that a little more in a few moments. We also have insects that may be a danger to humans. Bees, wasps, and certain spiders can be hazardous to human health. So if you find those in your institution, you'll want to work with your facility staff and potentially pest control professionals to act quickly to find out where they're coming from and remedy the problem. For example, several months ago, we had a few wasps in one of our spaces in my institution. So our facility staff had to locate and remove the nest on the outside of the building and seal some gaps around a window to protect our staff and patrons. Some pests may not present a direct problem themselves, but they may indicate a larger issue. Those are called indicators. For example, spiders and house centipedes feed on insects that eat collection materials. So if you see a lot of spiders and stray bug parts in your traps, that could indicate a potential infestation. Book lice are teeny tiny little reddish orange dots. Even with a magnifying lens, they're very hard to see. And they like to feed on microscopic molds and can infest paper and cardboard. They prefer warm and humid environments, so they can be an indicator that you have a humidity problem in your collection storage area. Blunderers are pests that aren't hazardous to collections or people. They just happen to wander into your traps. Ants, ladybugs, grasshoppers, etc. For example, every spring we see a ton of crickets in some of our traps in some of our library buildings. That shows us how poorly sealed those buildings are, which is definitely an issue that we're aware of, but they're not really hazardous to people or collections. Sometimes you may also find other pests, like rodents, raccoons, bats, birds. Those also pose a hazard to collection materials because they can use the collection materials for housing or contaminate them with waste and droppings. If you happen to find rodents in a sticky trap, you want to make sure to free them because that's cruel to the animals. And I've been told you can use vegetable oil or mineral oil to unstick them from the adhesive and then use a pencil eraser to sort of scoot them off and set them free. Although luckily I've never had to deal with that situation personally. Depending on your building, you may have to work on sealing holes in roof or attic space. I used to work in a historic house museum that had a major squirrel problem. So again, it's important to know your building and find out where pests are getting in, if there's a source of food that's drawing them, and so forth. You don't necessarily need to invest a large amount of time identifying every single pest that shows up in one of your sticky traps. It's more important to identify the things that are a threat to collection materials, as well as things that can indicate a larger problem. So here are two recent traps that my students picked up last week. The first shows a lot of small black and brown dots. Those are sort of hard to see, but they're springtails. They are not a danger to humans and they don't eat collections, but they do prefer higher levels of relative humidity, and they may indicate a humidity problem in one of our spaces. So that's something we'll need to look into further. The second photo includes traps that have a large number of crickets. And again, these are not dangerous to collections or people, but they do indicate that there's gaps in the building that are allowing pests to get in. And so they may be allowing other pests that could be potentially dangerous into our spaces. We pick up our traps monthly and replace them with new. And then my student staff identify the pests and we record them in a spreadsheet that looks something like this. This allows us to get a good sense of what kind of pests we see in our various locations, and we can compare month to month or year to year to get a good sense of seasonal changes and how any building construction or improvement impacts the data. It's a good idea to monitor and track your pests for at least 12 full months to get a good picture of the seasonal data. For example, we have hot and humid summers and cold and snowy winters where I live, so the data varies quite a bit from season to season. There are a few resources that may be helpful when identifying pests. Museumpest.net has a pest ID guide, although it is primarily focused on the United States and I believe parts of Europe. They also have an email listserv called the Pest List, and it includes members from both cultural heritage professionals and entomologists from different parts of the world. And folks often submit photos of traps or insects that they found in their collections area and ask for assistance with pest identification. There's also a book pictured here called The Field Guide to Insects of South Africa that has more than 1,000 common insects with full color detailed pictures. And there's also an app that focuses on insects of South Africa, though I haven't tried the app personally. And the United States National Park Service has a nice guide for identifying what type of pest you may have based on what type of collection damage you might see in your collection materials. So the final stage in the IPM process is pest treatment. One of the main ways to treat small infestation and prevent them from growing or returning is policy enforcement. Enforcing food and drink policies, disposing of food waste properly, cleaning up any water sources, and so forth. We also consider whether it's a small or large infestation. If it's just a couple of books with some signs of bug damage, that's easier to treat, although large infestations require that we coordinate with our facility staff and potentially our university facility staff and get pest control involved. One of our first moves is to isolate and quarantine the objects. Typically, we use thick zip top bags to prevent pests from spreading to other objects, and we isolate the book in the designated dirt room. We freeze books that we suspect have any insect life. This works great for books. We can wrap them in plastic bags, freeze for a few weeks, and then slowly let them acclimate back to room temperature before we remove them from the plastic to avoid condensation. Other kinds of artifacts, for example, some kind of paintings and artworks on canvas, don't like to be frozen, so you may want to consult a conservator before you go with the freezing option. If you do decide to freeze collection materials, you need a freezer that is capable of cooling quickly, because if the freezer cools down slowly, some pests can sort of go into a hibernation phase, and then they can wake back up when they're thawed. Whereas quickly freezing is more likely to kill all life stages of the pest. Some institutions also use heat to treat materials. It can accelerate the aging of some materials, although I do know a lot of public libraries in the United States tend to use thermal treatments, especially when dealing with bed bugs. Other cultural heritage organizations use anoxic treatments, which includes the removal of oxygen from an environment to kill any pests. Our last resort is chemical treatment. We do not apply chemicals directly to collection materials. We avoid fogging because we don't know what the impact of the chemicals might be on our collections. If we do have to resort to spraying or apply chemical treatment, we spray cracks in the building, we put out bait traps, and that is our last choice, but sometimes we do not have another option when dealing with a large pest infestation. So here are a few excellent resources that can help you if you decide you want to implement an integrated pest management program in your institution. The first is a book by my University of Illinois colleague, Krista D.C. Quinn, all about museum IPM. It's available for free as a PDF online, so please feel free to email me if you need me to send you a link. I already mentioned museumpest.net. They also have great and detailed information about everything from what traps to use and where to place them, as well as how to solve infestations and how to work with pest professionals. The Northeast Document Conservation Center, or NEDCC, has a great page on integrated pest management in cultural heritage spaces, as well as leaflets on other collections care related topics. Similarly, the U.S. National Park Service has a series of conservograms dedicated to procedures and best practices for museum collections, including several about pests and IPM. So now I will hopefully be able to join you via Zoom to answer any questions you might have about my presentation. However, if that doesn't work, or if you think of any questions later, please feel free to email me and I will do my best to answer. Thank you so much.